This podcast is part of the Choircast Network.
This is Radical Love Live, an ongoing series of podcasts and special events where we explore faith outside the boxes. Hosted by Mark Dilcom and Kelly Wilson.
Hey, Kelly.
Hey, Mark.
How are you?
I am good. I'm hanging in there. It's been a long week, but I'm glad to be here with you and with all our guests today.
Yeah. It's good to see you in studio. So I'm making it. So
yeah, how are you doing?
I'm freaking awesome as always. You know me. I'm in really an amazing space. Like, things are just flowing.
You're very. I think you're still glowing from the last episode.
Yes. So this one will come out. So for our listeners that have not listened to the episode that I recorded solo with Brother Timothy Jolly of the Holy Cross Monastery in upstate New York, please listen to it. It is probably one of the most beautiful conversations I've ever had. Not that this one's going to be awesome as well, but he knows how to live the life of Christ and that love that just pours out of him.
Sounds awesome. Yeah,
pretty extraordinary.
Yeah, so definitely go back and listen to that one after
we listen to this conversation. So, speaking of which, let's talk about this one. Who do we have with us today, my friend?
Well, today we have a whole panel.
We do.
The editors of the book Preaching the Uncontrolling Love of God, which contains sermons, essays, and worship elements from the perspective of open, relational, and process theology. So today in the studio with us, we have, or not in the studio, but connected online, we have Jeffry Wells and Vikki Randall and Thomas Jay Oord. And I'm going to go and look at their bios real quick. Jeffry Wells is the lead pastor of the Church of the Village, a progressive, radically inclusive, and anti-racist community in New York City. He is very involved in process, relational, and open relational theology. And there's so many different qualifications here.
Oh my gosh, this is going to take 5 minutes just to introduce Jeff.
Don't do that.
And we also have Vikki Randall with us today.
Hi, Vikki.
She lives in Monrovia, California, and has 28 years of pastoral experience serving large and small churches, mostly in PC, USA.
Nice.
She has a Doctor of Ministry from Azusa Pacific Seminary, is passionate about transformation and experiencing God's presence.
And then what about this last guy we have on here?
Yeah, he's a loser.
Repeat.
That one.
Yeah, he keeps turning up.
Like a bad feeling?
Yeah, regular listeners will recognize Tom Oord. He's a theologian, philosopher, and scholar of multidisciplinary studies. He directs the Center for Open and Relational Theology. And I skipped a page. He works with Northwind Seminary and is a writer and speaker. And you can find out more about him at thomasjayoord.com. And we're going to put everybody's website addresses in the show notes so they can check out something about.
Oh, and overall, awesome people all around, right?
Yes.
Yes, all three of them.
Yeah, I'm really curious to dive into this whole, we've kind of hit the surface of open and relational and process theology a couple of times, interested to get a bunch of new perspectives on it.
Yeah. So, all right. So Vikki, Tom, and Jeff, great to have you on here. So let's dig in. Ooh, wow. Which of you would like to start first?
I usually start first because I can tell the backstory to this book.
Go for it.
So I started dipping my toe in to process theology in about 2017. I read a book by Robert Mesley, which was an introduction to process theology, and then other people on the pastoral staff at Church of the Village had already studied process theology, and so we just kind of kept talking about it in our worship planning team, and eventually in 2021 organized our first worship series that was explicitly designed to teach process theology to the congregation. And so after that, I thought, well, maybe we can take these sermons that we've used in this series, and we had guest preachers like Catherine Keller and John Stamino and Ignacio Castuera, and then Tom preached later in that fall, and I thought, we'll just put these together in a little pamphlet or booklet, and distribute it among the congregation or people who might be interested. And then it kind of got put on the back burner because so much was going on at that time. In 2021, we were coming out of being only online, trying to create hybrid worship and all of that. So it wasn't really until the February of 2023 that the idea got revived when I mentioned the idea of this kind of a book to Mary Elizabeth Moore at the 50th anniversary conference of the Center for Process Studies. And she said, well, you can't wait. You have to do this book now. We need this book. And she can be very persuasive. So,
Okay.
but it really motivated me to want to get back to it. And so then I asked the Church of the Village for a leave of 9 weeks over that following summer to begin working on the book. And wonderfully, one of the first people who I talked to about it was Tom Oord. And I was just contacting Tom to ask him for recommendations for contributors to the book. But when I explained my vision for what this book might include, he said, well, I want to be your co-editor. And let's get a couple other people to help us do the editing of all the submissions that we're going to get. And so then he recruited Vikki and Nicole to be part of the editorial team. And that was the beginning of a wonderful relationship. And we managed to put the book together in about 8 months and get it put out by Sacrisage Press in time for a preaching conference about open relational and process theology, which Tom had already begun organizing. And so we had it out by April 1st, and we went to the preaching conference with it on April 11th and 12th. And it's been just a joyride ever since. Kind of all of us, or maybe 3 of us at a time, at least, getting together on a variety of podcasts and also helping to publicize it in many other ways. So
Wow.
It's been exciting.
Thank you, Jeff, for that. And the title itself, it's a compelling title, Preaching the Uncontrolling Love of God. And it sounds so simple, but and especially in my kind of context, and for anybody that's part of an institution, I was like, yeah, but what does that really mean? And so here you've broken it down. So,
and I actually wanted more words on the cover. I wanted it to say and you didn't even read the subtitle. I mean, the subtitle is much longer. But I wanted it to say preaching and practicing, because the reality is that this book is not just about preaching. And it's not just for preachers and clergy. It's for lay people. It's for people who plan worship. It's for musicians. It's for people who write liturgies and all of that. So I think that's one of the great values of this book, is that it's for a wide range of people in churches, or even people outside of churches who want to understand these ideas better. And it's very accessible. I mean, the essays and sermons are all very accessible. So it's got a lot of really great theology in it, but it's not a book of theology.
It's still being recorded when it's written like that. In the final edit, it'll look good.
Although that was kind of a longer delay there. Jeff, we lost you for just a moment. We'll cut this section out. So you were you lost about 10 seconds.
Okay.
It will be uploaded, but we didn't quite hear the context of the question or what your statement.
Okay. So I was saying the one of the great values of this book is that it is so accessible. It is not a book of theology, but it contains a lot of great theology. But it's written in a way that your average layperson in a congregational setting would be able to pick it up and get a lot out of it. And it's for a whole variety of people, not just preachers and clergy, but anybody in a church, especially church leaders, especially those who are planning worship or participating in worship or writing liturgy for worship or songs for worship. But really any member of a church. In fact, you could use this in a class in a local church to teach open relational and process theology. And a couple people have suggested that because the submissions are relatively short, you could even use this as a devotional book. It's got a wide variety of uses and purposes, and it's a great resource. And the other thing that I think is so important about it is there's a little bit of, or been a little bit of a distinction, maybe even sometimes a kind of distance between the open and relational community and the process community. Process tends to be much more in the mainline Protestant church, and open and relational attracts more people who are evangelical or evangelical, and it draws those communities together. And I think that's a beautiful part of it.
I'm just processing through that because didn't even think that, from a ex-evangelical or people that have stepped away from church, do you feel like that this is a gateway back into community and re-engage is through this book and through the writings that are in it?
I certainly do, but maybe Vikki or Tom could respond to that question too.
Yeah, I definitely think so. That's kind of the space that I'm ministering in now. People who are, I often call them affirming curious evangelicals. People are kind of
I love affirming curious. That's the first time I've heard
affirming
that.
curious evangelicals.
Yeah.
It's kind of my sweet spot.
Mhm.
But yeah, people who are sort of wavering in this place where they're questioning a lot of their evangelical assumptions and things that don't quite fit with evangelicalism, particularly as evangelicalism has taken this hard turn toward Calvinism and all that comes with that. And there's people that are questioning that and finding it not fitting, and yet they're kind of wavering in this place of where do I go next?
Yeah.
And I do find that open theism in particular is really helpful for them, really answers a lot of those questions, helps them really hold on to their faith in a powerful way and hold on to the things that are good and holy and right, while still being able to notice the things that aren't fitting and aren't working.
It's so interesting. There's a lot of, I've seen a lot of folks on social media who are ex-evangelicals who have a very easy line of attack against the faith that they grew up in, because it's like, well, if God is all knowing and all powerful and all benevolent, then how is this possible? And how does God allow this? And how does God allow this? And then they make the leap to, and therefore I don't believe in God anymore.
Right.
And
Right.
well,
Right.
it's easy to answer the questions if you're the ones if you made up the questions in the first place, like God has to be all these things, therefore that God is impossible. How does, and this is really for listeners who aren't as familiar with open theology, how does open theology, or specifically some things in this book, answer some of those issues that people are running up against?
Well, maybe I'll jump in here and say that there are a set of questions that I and others in the book have addressed over and over in our lives. Questions about, problems of suffering. Why doesn't a loving God stop that? Questions about justice. Questions about understanding love. How can God be loving if God sends people to hell forever? How can God be loving if God is unemotional and uninvolved in creation? questions about evolution and AI and neuroscience. But there's all these things that I think people who have inquiring minds, they want to know how does theology respond to that? And if you grow up in more conservative religious circles, evangelical, etc., you're typically told answers that, for the most part, end up not making a lot of sense to you. And so some people will go the direction we've already mentioned. They'll just sort of give up on God altogether. But there's another phenomenon that maybe some of you are also familiar with. Some people will not give up belief in God. They'll stay in a church. Maybe they'll go to a more liberal mainline church, but it's a church that really doesn't talk much about God. It talks about social justice issues, and they're on the right side on those things. But God is kind of bracketed out, like, okay, you know.
Yeah.
Almost quite literally sometimes. Like,
Yeah,
it's like,
yeah.
we're not going to talk about that part.
Exactly. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so what open and relational process thought says is, look, we care about those social issues too, but we think there's a view of God that makes sense of our lives, that makes sense intellectually, that makes sense of science, etc. And that comes like a breath of fresh air to not only those mainline folks, but also those evangelicals who had similar questions.
Yeah, and we had that experience very directly led us to kind of going in the direction of open relational and process theology, because the Church of the Village was already a very called itself progressive and radically inclusive and anti-racist, but we struggled with having a deeper understanding of what we meant by progressive Christianity, and when we started to really get into teaching and preaching open relational and process theology, it was like a revelation, not just for the pastoral team or the worship planning team, but for the congregation, who responded so positively to those ideas. And another thing, besides what Tom's already mentioned, that was so important for me personally, and I think for a congregation, was the idea in open relational process theology of the relationality of God. So God is not some distant being who intervenes occasionally in our lives to affect some particular decision or to move us in a particular direction, but that happens moment to moment. Every moment, God is there accompanying us, but also offering us the best possibilities for moving into the next moment and building a future collaboratively between us and God.
Yeah, if I can follow up on that, what I've seen in my own life and in my congregations that I've served is when you have a theological system that doesn't make sense, that has all these gaps that Tom mentioned, about suffering, about God's love, and is asking you to hold these mutually contradictory ideas that God is love and he sends people to hell. God is love and allows suffering. You have all these mutually cognitive dissonance going on. What happens is you tend to shut down a little bit. You shut down emotionally, you shut down intellectually, you shut down theologically, and you can't really relate to that God that doesn't make sense. So it becomes a very, people remain in churches for a variety of reasons, but it isn't really the kind of enlivening faith that I think comes when your faith makes sense, when you have a system that makes sense, when you're not having to exclude science, you're not having to exclude your experience of the world, what you experience of the world that includes both beauty and suffering. And when you have a theological system that includes those things, that allows you to ask questions, allows you to think big, that takes those questions seriously and doesn't ask you to hold mutually exclusionary ideas, doesn't ask you to believe something that is not lived out in your experience. it just becomes so enlivening. It just becomes so much more real. And you're able to see God at work in the world when your picture of God is consistent with your experience of the world.
Can I share when Vikki was talking, something that happened to me last week jumped to my mind. I want to share it with you all. I was at a think tank in Boston, and they'd flown people in literally from around the world, philosophers, psychologists, some activists who were famous, and if I could share their names, you'd know who they were. And people representing the Harvards and the Oxfords, and so these high and mighty 15 of us sitting around, and we were talking about what would it mean to love people who are across the divide, are different from us politically, sexuality issues, et cetera, et cetera. And, the psychologists, they sort of talk about what they do, and the philosophers are angling, and, and I'm in the midst of things. And it came my turn to share, and I've been scheduled near the end of the event. And I decided I was just going to get up and do my little open and relational evangelism. And so I started off by saying, look, polls say that anywhere from 80 to 95% of Americans believe in God in some sense. And a bunch of those people justify the way they treat queer people, the way they think about folks across the political aisle, the way they think about conflicts overseas. They justify that by their particular view of God. God wants us to like these people and not those people. God wants us to kill those folks because they're going to hell anyway. God doesn't like, the LGBTQ community because they're et cetera, et cetera. Yep. And I said, these people, they're using their theology to do the things that in this conference we're trying to say we want to get rid of. We want to see people come together and not fight in these ways. What if there's a vision of God that overcomes all of those barriers and that justification people use for violence and distancing and shunning and ostracizing? What if there's a God who exists, who loves everybody, who doesn't punish anybody in hell, who's really involved moment by moment? I said, now, if that God exists, that's the open and relational God that I believe in. And it was wild. So again, these are 15 high profile people. They're just like coming after me with questions like eagerly. Oh yeah, that's like they want to believe in that God. They just really haven't been presented. And I felt like I was like 15-year-old doing street evangelism or something.
You're gonna get some track, bring it up.
We need cheap tracks for open relational theology.
Tom, to your point, you're absolutely. So here you are with these folks, right? And because this is for the average person, they're like, put in a relational what? Let alone even theology, because that's not a word that is in our common everyday conversations anyway. Who talks theology? But yet we need to, because if we are going to explore our own faith and what we are as divine souls and what does that mean, you have to have some theology. But for years, churches kept us away from that. And I say us as a layperson, like, well, we'll tell you what we think you need to know, and we're going to recite these particular scriptures and everything else. I was like, that sucks. That's really kind of shitty church, and that's shitty theology. And I'm going to be blunt, because I am one of those people. Like, well, I do have questions, and I want answers, and I want to be able to go explore, and let me do my work. Bop, 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 bop. And so I get feisty about that, and I'm always anti-institutionalist. But what you talk about, Tom, is people are craving this, and all of this in this book that you guys have created. And this in your own ministries that you're doing. The only way that this will work is when people when we're allowed to explore in an open and relational, affirming. And I'm going to also go one step. Just another point is somebody that Jeff and Tom, he was at the conference there in February at Drew University. He's a Nazarene pastor as well. And I interviewed him for something else. And he was telling me why he's now, by the way, given notice, he's leaving his congregation. It was over his 14-year-old daughter. She did not want to bring her friends into the church that her father is the senior pastor, who's extremely loving, but yet she has queer friends, and she didn't want to subject us to it. And so here he is as her father, and also, what does he do? So his faith is just crumbled right from underneath him for this. And my point to all of that is that's the ultimate truth, right? Because, it's these children that see it, especially nowadays, they're just I'm not going to tolerate me being told how I'm going to love my friends or how I'm not going to love my friends.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I sometimes like to say we need a theology that matches our deepest moral intuitions.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if you've got moral intuitions that contradict your view of God, then maybe you ought to get rid of that view of God instead of suppressing those intuitions.
Right. If you're one of those love the sinner, hate the sin type people, maybe stop at love the sinner. If somebody
Full stop.
that you love, that you were I would never do anything to this, but God, he's really concerned about what you're doing at night in bed. It's always so weird to me to put myself in a position where I love someone more than God does. It just doesn't seem right.
And it's not what you see in the New Testament. You don't see
That's
see people outdoing Jesus in loving other people.
No, you're
And
not.
Jesus
Right.
having, all right, I'll accept that person. It's just and as Tom says, to flip what Tom was saying about the view of God, when your view of God is kind of this classical theism or Calvinist view of God as all controlling, all domineering, and mysterious, and we can't possibly understand, and allows all these things that intuitively seem really bad to us, like genocide, that kind of seems bad.
Right.
God allows it, and we're supposed to just accept that and be okay with it. It's the flip of what Tom was saying. It doesn't make sense. You have to train yourself to shut down emotionally, to think of God as distant and not involved. It's the opposite of what we know of God in Jesus. That this is a God that is knowable. This is a God that is relatable. This is a God of love, and a God that serves rather than controls. Greg Boyd talks about power under rather than power over. That we think of God as power over, but Jesus is always showing us power under. That lifts up rather than
Beautiful.
presses. Yeah.
Yeah, lifting up, not suppressing. So
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you three a question, because you all have your ministries and you've been out there. When does the sea change start to happen, or maybe it's happening and I'm just not seeing it, where you from the pulpit point of view start bringing along, or in your community, maybe it's outside of the pulpit actually, bringing your community along in these kind of very engaging conversations? And this is probably what this book does, right? Where it takes people, it enlivens them, and it allows them to connect outside of what is is a traditional way. And then I say, well, then if that's starting at the community level, when do seminaries and other start to change the way that thought leaders and faith leaders are going to learn the process?
Yeah, I mean, there are a small number of seminaries that do teach process theology or open and relational theology, but on the other level, on the ground, at the local congregational level, I think it's certainly much more widespread than I ever imagined before I worked on this book. I mean, we have contributors from across the U.S., all regions of the U.S., even places where you would think, the Southeast is going to be too conservative to have this kind of church. And that's not the case, especially in urban areas. Across the U.S., across Canada, we have a handful of contributors from Europe and one from South Africa. And I'm sure there are many, many more. We just, we're just touching the tip of the iceberg, I think. With what's actually happening in the world.
Wow.
I did notice that in my last theology class that I was in, there was a paragraph in Alistair McGrath about process theology.
A paragraph.
You can know
Yeah.
when they're like at the end, but
I mean, the great thing is that there's so many more resources right now.
yeah,
Especially right now than there were 10 years ago, or there were a lot of maybe kind of academic books about process theology, and I think Tom is responsible for a great deal of this because his writing is so accessible, and even the term open and relational is much more accessible than process theology. Even John Cobb told me that he likes that terminology better than process theology. But it just worked out so beautifully that this book and the book that Tom and Tripp Fuller wrote called God After Deconstruction came out at almost exactly the same time.
Yeah.
But and a 2 years before, Ron Allen's book called You Never Preach from the Same Pulpit Twice, which is a beautiful theological exposition on process preaching, that we have those things available to us now. And then there are others that we can name as well. Lots of people are writing about it. And I think, I just feel like this is a moment where we're at an inflection point, that we're at a turning point, and there's going to be a lot more people looking at this seriously, and I could see it spreading. I mean, I love the way that Brian McLaren put it in his endorsement for our book, where he said there are tens of thousands of clergy and churches across the country that will benefit from this book. That's not his exact words, but that was the gist of it. I actually think there are hundreds of thousands. And if we can envision that possibility, we can move toward it. And you can just, if you think about that for just a moment, you can imagine what an impact that could have on politics in our country, on the economy, on how we organize our communities.
Well, it needs to happen. We can't see where we're at. That's for sure. Tell me you were going to say something. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think I would answer your question, sort of thinking about it sociologically and how groups and individuals are acting in our current world.
Yeah.
There are groups that are like Jeff's congregation, who already have a pretty progressive social ethic, but are searching for a theological framework. And so I can see some of those groups being really attracted to this book and open and relational theology in general. There are also a group of people, congregations leaving evangelical denominations. Many of them are associated with a group called the Post-Evangelical Collective, and they meet. I was just at one of their meetings a couple months ago, and hundreds and hundreds of pastors, many of them identifying as open and relational, even though they weren't quite sure what that was. That sounds right to them. And then sociologically, we, as Jeff mentioned, there's so much being said about deconstruction these days, not just evangelicals, but people in the Catholic tradition and even mainline and other religious traditions. And there's a moving out of institutions that have either harmed through their teaching or through their practices. And those folks as individuals are looking for frameworks, and open and relational process thought helps there. But I think one of the biggest obstacles comes from the church itself and the way it's set up as an institution. Groups and institutions are formed typically because they want to retain or preserve something they found that was helpful in the past. And the people who are elected to positions or designated for leadership, they feel a certain obligation to protect and preserve whatever that was in the past. And so institutions, just by their very nature, are going to be less likely to be looking for some sort of new way of thinking about God if it opposes where they came from. And so what usually happens is those groups just keep chugging along, doing their thing, making slight tweaks and variations. I mean, it's always changing, but some of those changes pretty minor. until a crisis comes along.
Of course.
And that crisis comes along, that's, I believe, the time that often open and relational theology takes that crack and start running with it. Start making some change, because people know there's a problem, and now we got to figure out some solution.
Well said, Tom. Very well said. I'm just, I love this conversation, especially about, what the book represents, but also just this enlivening. So I'm going to reference the interview I had with Brother Timothy, and, he just pours out Christ's love. It's just 100%. It's there. And he is so excited about the evolution. That's my word. He didn't use that word, but about what he sees. He knows things are changing as well as a monastic himself and the work he does. And so while we didn't talk about open and relational theology in that conversation, he sees it. He feels it, right? We all feel it. It reminds me of the time cover, is God dead? In some period of time, people are like, well, maybe God is dead. God's not dead, whatever you call it. But, and people are like, well, Jesus, that's out. And it's all of these boxed up things. So, when I look at what we did here at Radical Love Live, our tagline is, exploring faith outside the boxes. And that's exactly what open and relational theology is about, right? That's you have no box. You get to do and explore what you feel, what calls your heart. And you do this in community where there's no rigidity, or there's no institution, there's no absolutes. But that's going to be very uncomfortable for a lot of folks, right? As well. But oh my God, if you're willing to go there, the depth that you're going to have with your own faith is going to, you embody it. You're going to feel it in your heart space where you wouldn't otherwise. What a concept.
Absolutely.
I have a question about some of the points of resistance to open and relational theology, because I come from a evangelical background from way back, and then kind of passed through charismatic Pentecostal for a little bit before ending up in mainline. But there's still a lot of people in my life who like to talk about how, about God's miracles, and, God's doing this for me and God's doing that for me. And I want to support, and I feel like God does a lot for me. But in specific situations, I'll see like somebody has a healing, they're healed from something, and they're like, oh, that is so awesome. Like God really, listened to my faith and listened to my prayer. And my first thought is always, does that mean that God didn't listen to the faith and prayers of all the other people who didn't get healed today? And then there's millions of them. Yep. And, and I,
it's like a lottery. Here, let me draw which one I'm going to pay attention to.
Well, to explain this in my mind with some kind of algorithm of, some kind of combination of faith and need and opportunity. And somehow it all adds up to the miraculous. But in general, for people who need for God to be all powerful, who need, I always need to know that God's in control. I know that God's got me in this one. Even if God doesn't heal me, I know that God is not healing me for a reason, because he's teaching me some lesson in building character. When people run up against that obstacle, what is the open and relational response to that need for that power?
I'd love to hear Vikki answer.
Yeah.
that.
I'll jump in. Yeah, because I think that's really more of a pastoral question than a theological question, because you do have to choose your moment. And I know when people are in the moment of suffering, for example, or a moment of loss, there is a comfort to classical theism or even Calvinism. There's a comfort in knowing, even when terrible things are happening to you, to feel like, okay, there's this God that has some kind of barrier, and maybe God is allowing worse things to happen than I wish, but there's some barrier, or if I do this right or do that right, maybe God will heal me. I mean, there is some comfort in that, and pastorally you have to attend to that. I think there comes a point where all of those questions that you just mentioned come to the forefront. There comes a point when, but it's generally when you're out of the crisis. It's generally when you're not in that moment of crisis, I think, when people begin to look around and say, wow, I was healed, but here's somebody else whose child had the same leukemia that my child had who didn't make it. Or here's somebody who had, you start to notice the global nature of suffering. You start to notice the bigger pictures and the big questions come across. And that's where I think it's very pastoral, and that some of the, both the essays and the sermons in this book address that there is a pastoral element to this as well. And not, we love this so much that we can sit around and just talk for hours. But there is a pastoral sensitivity to where people are, and even with congregations, to take them step by step, and not. It is a major paradigm shift, especially for those in evangelical or Calvinist systems. It's a major paradigm shift, and some people are so disillusioned with Calvinism that they're ready to jump right away and go for it. But a lot of people, it's going to take a slow step-by-step process that just begins by allowing the questions, and allowing people to ask the questions is really where it begins. But it is, I think, a pastoral moment as probably even more than a theological moment at that point.
Wow, that's great. So as we're kind of wrapping up here, we have a few minutes to talk. So how does somebody get hold of the book? That's question one. It's out in Amazon, right? But what does somebody do with it? But if individually, what would I do with this book? Do I get a community together? Do I take it to my church and say, let's do? What do you think? How does that go?
Well, once you have the book, and after you've read some of it, I like to encourage anybody who actually likes the book to go on Amazon and write a short review.
Okay.
Because that helps to encourage other people to want to buy the book. But there are a whole lot of things that someone can do if they want to help participate in promoting this and helping spread these ideas. So ask your local library to get the book. If you're teaching or a student at a seminary or even at a college, ask the school library to get the book. To show it to your pastor, or buy a copy for your pastor.
Yeah, right.
And then have a conversation with your pastor about why these ideas resonate with you. Share it on social media. If you have access to some other kind of publication, write a review that you can get published somewhere else. There are just a ton of things that people can do. And then, of course, organize a discussion group in your congregation. If you can bring somebody in who can facilitate that, who's well-versed in process or open and relational theology, that's even better. But you don't have to have that to have a discussion about it.
So are you guys thinking about what's next in that to support online communities about discussion groups around the book?
So we do have a Facebook group that's called Preaching and Practicing the Uncontrolling Love of God. So I would encourage people to go and join that group. It's a private group, but we're very open about admitting people into the group. And there's also a YouTube channel where we have posted the video recordings of some of the sermons that are included in the book. That's a nice way to share them as well. And some of those are recordings of the complete worship service, so you can see the ways that those ideas are incorporated in other ways besides just in the preaching. What else, Tom or Vikki?
Well, I think in general, one of the things, this is not really a specific way to use the book, but more of a meta issue. Process Open Relational Thought has a pretty extensive literature in the academy, working through, we'll call into the details that scholars care a ton about, the minutia.
Right.
And so much of that is not accessible to the typical person. And what makes this preaching book helpful is that you don't have to know. You don't have to have a graduate degree in theology or philosophy to read these sermons and say, oh, this helps me in this way or that way, or I'm going to use this in the next group discussion I have at my church or my beer theology group or whatever. You can read these essays and see how they apply to the questions and issues that you're facing as an individual without having to know all the academic background.
And I feel that way about God After Deconstruction as well. That's very accessible. And Tom and Tripp recorded video sessions on each chapter in the book. So those are helpful too. And,
Thanks, Joe.
So I think between the two of those things, somebody could get a really good grounding in open relational and process theology.
Absolutely. I'm glad you said that, Jeff. And I don't want to cut you off, Vikki, because I'm sure you probably have some. Sure. Those two books do go quite nicely together. Buy them as a gift set, folks.
And also, I mean, people can find lots of resources on the Center for Open and Relational Theology, or at the Cobb Institute, or the Process in Faith program of the Center for Process Studies. They're just great online. Oh, and also Jay McDaniel's website, Open Horizon, is a terrific place to find resources.
Oh, cool.
All right.
Yeah, I was just going to mention Jay McDaniel's Open Horizons, because what he started doing on that was taking one chapter a week and reading it, or one entry, and then having a little devotional on it. And they're really quite delightful and very accessible. And that's the kind of thing you could do, as Tom said, read it devotionally, and then have a blog or have a Facebook page where you respond to it and write your thoughts, or what did you like about this?
Yeah.
I love that. Look, he's got a picture of that bird that's singing in the background.
Which of you have the lovely bird that's it's a part of our conversation?
I don't know.
I don't think it's me.
Oh, it's one of you three. Absolutely. So, and I'm sure it's coming through the recording as well. So
Yeah, very lovely.
lovely.
It's probably me. I'm sitting in our house that's on the Delaware River, and I have the window open so you can hear. Probably hear the
that's
birds
what
in
it
the
is.
background.
Yes. The birds are happy, Jeff.
Oh yes, yes. It's a beautiful day here.
Well, so this conversation has been enlightening in so many different ways. And Tom, I know you need to scoot in just a moment. So we'll send you off with love and blessings. And so glad that you joined us. Jeff and Vikki, you're going to stick around for a second, right?
Sure.
Great. So I Jeff, when we had the conversation, when we had lunch a couple of weeks ago, and we talked about a variety of things, and one of which was this book as well. And I'm still trying to really get my head around, but how does this work for somebody like me and reading it? And this conversation is opening it up. So, but you're right. Maybe having practice would be nice to have that as well in the title of the book, but it is what it is. So again, I'm going to circle back to what I asked a couple of minutes ago. So you gave a variety of ways that we can engage the book, but this also really is somebody that just individually, they can read this and just spend time with it.
Definitely. Yes. And I've had a number of people in our congregation who have bought the book and are going through it, and I hear from them periodically, oh, I read such and such, and I really love these ideas. And I was just at the regional conference for the United Methodist Church last week, and I had about 25 copies of the book that I put out on a table, and they sold out in 2 days.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that's saying something in the context of where you are. So yes.
Plus I got another 15 people to sign up on for the mailing list and potentially to be part of discussion groups. I had in the fall, I was at a clergy gathering where I got about 20 clergy members to sign up that are interested in process theology. So I think that often people are intimidated about trying to bring ideas that are not part of the mainstream of their church or of their denomination into conversation with people.
Absolutely, they're intimidated because we're trained. I don't know what word. We're conditioned. How about we use that? That's a better word. that everything is top down, right? And I'm not, that's not a slight against you two in particular, right? But it's just how it's been. And it's like, ugh, enough of the top down stuff. Can we be collegial? Can we be bottom up? I don't know, something different than top down, because it doesn't seem to work so well, right?
Yeah, it's hard to get away from the top-down aspect when you're in a denomination that has bishops and district superintendents. But
Yes, it's very.
Or even one that doesn't.
But
You still have top down.
One that have presbyteries and
Right, the presbytery.
synods and
Yeah.
Right.
I-
Look at the origins of those words. Like, isn't the presbytery basically like old people? Doesn't that?
is it the presbytery what?
Essentially means old people.
Yeah,
I mean, elder.
it is. Yeah, yeah.
Well, in the like
The
Episcopal.
wise ones.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of this is maybe a point in the history of the United Methodist Church where there's a bigger opening than there has been in a long time for these
Yes,
kinds of
yeah.
ideas to come in, because
Mm.
so much there's been a huge schism. We lost 25% of the churches who left, who disaffiliated and left the denomination. And I think that there's potentially a lot more openness right now if we can find the ways to get this book and this information and these theological ideas into people's consciousness.
Absolutely. So let's take that angle with you two for a moment, because Tom alluded to it, and I love this notion about, is this book does it have the potential, which sounds like it does, to actually start healing at a, dare I use the word, cultural level? Like
in generational level.
in generational. That's a great word.
Because we are seeing such a huge generational shift.
Yep.
And along these lines, and a lot, as Jeff alluded to, a lot on the lines of affirming and inclusive, and
Yep.
what does it mean to embrace the fullness of the love of God.
Yeah.
I was teaching a workshop on that to affirming curious evangelicals when the vote came down from the United Methodist Church. And one of the wise elder members of my group said, that's the cost of love. That's and you have invested in love by what you have lost is your investment in love. And it was just very powerful. We went through it in the PCUSA 10 years ago. So we were right there with you, remembering our own journey. But yeah, it's very powerful. And what I found a lot, again, with this sort of ex-evangelical or affirming curious evangelicals, is that they need to be given permission. And a lot of it is that. It's just being given permission to believe something different than what they've been told is the exclusive truth of what Christianity is.
Mhm.
They've been given a very dogmatic, closed system. This is what it means. You're either in or you're out. And to give them permission to ask the hard questions, to give them permission to love their queer kids. That just breaks my heart that I have to even say that. And to give someone permission to do that.
Yeah.
But it's true, and I have these lovely groups of parents and grandparents who know they love their kids, and they just need to have permission to say that without having to qualify it,
Right.
Yeah. So it is a very poignant and difficult and beautiful time that I think we're in.
Yeah.
With so much possibility. And it will take pain, and it will take sacrifice, as our Methodist brethren have shown us. It will take sacrifice, but that's the cost of love. That's the cost of investing in love.
Wow.
After the vote at the General Conference, I was thinking about the impact of the conception of an uncontrolling God, and thinking, it took us 52 years to remove the harmful discriminatory language from the Book of Discipline, but that doesn't mean that God wasn't actively working toward that all the time, right?
Yes.
But there was a lot of human resistance to moving in that direction. It just, God can't, as Tom's book title says, God can't simply just change things.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
Everyone else it is.
it's working through human beings to get to a better place all the time. And in this particular case, it took 52 years. But then all of a sudden, I mean, of course, there was a lot of stuff happening in the background, and over all of that time, there were people. I was involved in the New York conference of the Methodist Church for a long time in helping to lead the group, the LGBT affirming advocacy group within the conference. So I've been at this for 24 years, and a lot of people much longer than that, many more decades. And there have been a lot of people who didn't live to see this come, who were part of that struggle. So all of that, like, that's how the world works, that God is always working on us to try to move us in better directions. But sometimes it takes a long time. God is very persistent and also very patient.
Thank you for sharing that, Jeff. That's beautiful.
It reminds me of something that a spiritual director of mine said when I was in crisis and I was going off and on, and he's like, and I was referencing to my own sobriety actually, and he's like, well, and I said, and then all of a sudden I was just, that day came, and he's like, well, yeah, probably not. That's not how that actually goes. Like that's called prevenient grace. And I'm like, I had never heard about that. And then he explains, it's like, it was always in motion. It was just, you just didn't know it until you knew it. And then there it was. So
Filling up.
exactly right.
The tipping point.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And right. Or call it tipping point.
Yeah.
I got to the tipping point and there we are. And I see this coming as well. And I see it in the love and the passion that you two have and what Tom has. And it's exciting. It's invigorating because it's, for me, it's always about, I want people to have, I desire the same wholeness that I have, I would want everybody else. Because when you get separated from your own divinity and you live in pain and suffering, you can't be whole. You can't be you're divine, but you don't even recognize it. And it's only when you come back into it that you get the fullness of life. And it's, it's ups and downs and everything else. But God, my life is a profound life today in so many ways than what it was before, when I was like, yeah, this doesn't work for me in any way, shape, or form, or I was, just an othered everything. So Godspeed on what you're doing here.
Yes, thank you. I think Vikki's congregation and mine are just full of people who experienced harm or experienced trauma in other religious spaces, and who have found their way to a community that actually celebrates them for just who they are. And that, I think we need so many more churches like that.
Yeah, so important.
Wow. Kelly, what a great conversation, huh?
Yeah, I'm so glad to have the opportunity to help share this work with the world. I think it's really important. I think it's going to touch and change a lot of people. So
thank you so much for having us on.
I have to say, Jeff, it's such a pleasure to see you again. Vikki, it was so nice to meet you. And I would love to have you guys back again. It would be great. So
We'd love to do that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Radical Love Live, co-hosted by Mark Dilcom and Kelly Wilson. All rights reserved. You can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, and other popular podcast platforms. Go to radicallovelive.com to learn more about us, watch recordings of our live events, and listen to our podcast. We also invite you to check out what Kelly and Mark are doing by going to our websites. Find Kelly at kellywilson.com and Mark at markdilcom.com. This is Radical Love Live, where we explore faith outside the boxes.